Good morning, late afternoon to everybody, depending on where you are, and welcome. I'm Chris Lyons, the CEO of FPSA, the Food Production Solutions Association. It's great to have you with us this afternoon. It's great to have you back if you were with us yesterday. If you were here yesterday for part one of our trade and tariff series, we spent some time getting grounded in where things stand today, what has changed, what actions you can take or your company can take, how tariffs are impacting your business right now. That was yesterday. Today is about looking ahead. So as you are probably aware, trade policy has moved quickly from kind of background noise to something that's directly shaping costs, sourcing decisions, supply chain impacts, global strategy. It's being wielded more as a tool. And for many companies, the challenge isn't just understanding what's happening, it's knowing what to watch and how to plan for what is coming next. So today's session is focused on the forward view, what's structurally different about today's trade approach, where policy and deal making are heading, how things may continue to be used this way, and how to get engaged more effectively in this environment. I am super pleased to welcome Becky Rasdall Vargas, who is the Senior Vice President of Trade and Workforce Policy at the International Dairy Foods Association, one of our peer associations. Becky brings a unique perspective across government, industry, and association leadership, including roles within the USDA and the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. So she's been directly involved in the kinds of policy decisions and negotiations that we're talking about today. We're very, very happy that she's going to share her experience and knowledge with us. So Becky, thank you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Chris. It's nice to be with everyone today. I'm delighted to be part two. I heard yesterday was great. It seemed like it was a great technical deep dive on the current tariffs, rules, and refunds. So let me go ahead and share my presentation and get us started. In order to kind of think through the some of the signals and trends moving forward, I do think you have to take a minute and kind of look at the current landscape a little bit further. So one of the things I'd like to do today is help us zoom out a little bit and look at the overall landscape, not just the current tariffs that are in effect, but the overall landscape. And to do that, you have to sort of look at the president himself. I don't know if everyone can see my screen. I'm having a hard time advancing my screen. It worked fine a minute ago, which is always fun. Is it advancing for you?
No, we have the title page up.
I love technology until I don't. Let me try that one more time, everybody. I apologize for that. One more share. Well, now it's not letting me do it as a show. So let me just, rather than waste everybody's time, if you can see it, let me just do it from here maybe.
Sure, it's fine.
Oh, no, maybe it'll behave. Okay, sorry about that. So I think you have to understand where we come from. And not only are tariffs an integral part of US history, that's been part of political movements, that's been a policy that's been in place for decades, and long before this president ever came to office, he really espoused tariffs, not just as a favored policy, but kind of like a personal conviction. And so you have to really understand that about this president in order to understand his administration and his thinking on trade. And so while he's been in office both terms, I put a quote in here from 1989 that he's not only said this several times over the course of the years, he's followed through with his actions. So these statutes of law I have reflected at the bottom of the slide there. In his first administration, he was the first person to used those on tariffs in a few decades. And in this administration, his second go around, he's the first time to use tariffs on some of those statutes of law ever. So he's really showing it what he's saying, not just verbally, but he's showing it in action. And he's also kind of showing his belief that in his first term, he discovered that tariffs weren't quite as durable and far-reaching as he wanted. And so this time he wants to make sure that what he does will last. And so with that, you do have to kind of zoom out and look at quite deeply all the tools that he has to make that happen. There's these 6 statutes available that have already been delegated by Congress to serve as tariffs for the president. They don't only do tariffs, but tariffs are one of the features that they offer. And I know you covered IEPA and 122 yesterday, so I won't go over those more, except to say that I think there is some discussion in Washington right now about how IEPA might be out for a broad use of tariffs, the way the Supreme Court ruled, and frankly, the administration's timeline for appealing the Supreme Court ruling on IEPA hasn't finished yet. So there's always that possibility. But at any rate, the discussion lately is, well, he could probably still get away with using IEPA tariffs under cases of distinctive circumstances like a conflict, a state of conflict, or an economic emergency like what we're seeing form up with Iran. So that'd probably be re-challenged in court if he reused it, no matter the circumstance, but he doesn't seem to be afraid of that. So that's just one thing I'd throw out there on IEPA. But that leaves us with just a few left, and I want to just go through these quickly to help you understand kind of what might happen in the remaining years of this administration and beyond. So let's start right there with that first column of Section 232 and why President Trump might favor this section of law. This is one that focuses on products and sectors, and it's been used before, so the precedent for it exists. Section 232 was challenged in 2019, but not successfully, so it's proven to be legally durable. And the focus on products or sectors allows the president to sort of customize the impact, so it only focuses on the sectors that he wants to target without a limit on timing. So you can see how a statute like this would create a layer of tariffs that the president could use to start building what essentially becomes like a matrix. And that's exactly what's happening. If you, I'll look at this slide and the next on two slides on what's being considered and threatened for investigation and what is being implemented under Section 232. And so there's generally the ones that are being considered, I want you to pay attention to a couple of things. One is the timeline of the threat or the investigation initiation being introduced. You can see there really haven't been any new investigations threatened or initiated in about the past 6 months, with the exception of critical minerals. So that gives us a broad base of a huge number of sectors that he's sort of dangled out there as for the possibility of later tariff implementation. He doesn't really need to take a whole lot more action, especially if the investigation has been initiated. There's not like a requirement for the government to provide updates on where they are in that investigation. And under the timelines of the statute, you can see that several of these should have been already completed by now if this were sort of a normal atmosphere that we were operating in. So one might presume that for those that it should have been completed already and they've had enough time, that they are completed and they're just sort of sitting there ready and waiting for the point at which the president might decide to pull the trigger on those tariffs. So this really gives them a broad base to say at any point in time, these could move forward into either from an investigation that's been threatened into investigation period, or for an investigation that was initiated a long time ago into actual tariffs. Now, I do mark here a few that are probably not likely to be completed. That's just my crystal ball based on the fact that we're in active conflict and we frankly need all of those products and sectors greater than we need the tariff on them in order to continue to be actively engaged in the conflict in the Middle East. But again, that's just me. I wouldn't think now would be a good time to start an investigation on oil and gas. Then you have the ones that are already implemented, 9 sectors in total. I know Courtney did a great job yesterday of covering the metals updates. And aside from those updates, these have all been in play for a while. So again, not a whole lot new, except just tweaks to them to exclude certain companies who are doing deals, or to amend them on the basis of negotiations, such as with the UK. And so all in all, that's a total of 22 sectors on which Section 232 tariffs have been considered or applied. So a lot for him to choose from, creates a nice base layer of tariffs to use. And so when you overlay that with Section 301, you can see why Section 301 might be, again, same reasons as 232, an option the president might favor. Precedent exists, it's been used before, it's survived legal challenges, it's legally durable, and even though it does show their limit on duration of action of 4 years, in practicality, the extension of that is something that really is kind of a check the box exercise, and so has been used in perpetuity. So a great example of that is China. We implemented Section 301 tariffs on China in response to our negotiations on phase 1. And those 301 tariffs have been amended and revised and reevaluated, but never lifted. So that's been years and years that those have been in play there. So very similar to 232, but focused more on countries. So the 2 investigations, and I know Courtney mentioned this quickly at the end, I just want to dive in to a little deeper detail. The 2 investigations that are out there now are on the failure to impose and effectively enforce a prohibition on forced labor and structural and excess capacity in production and manufacturing sectors. Those comment periods are due today. And I confess that I used AI to sort of try to generate lists of countries to see how similar they were to the lists that the president targeted for reciprocal tariffs 1 year ago in April 2025. And so that's what this graphic on the right is, a little comparison there. And essentially what we're looking at is the excess capacity 301 announcement closely mirrors IEPA. It's the forced labor one that significantly reshuffled the number of countries, adding a lot of major trading partners, and then removing a ton of those smaller economies that you see on the right. So this really creates a tighter country list that USTR is choosing from when assigning tariffs, and major traders only, giving them the opportunity to really hone in tariffs for the greatest impact, and effectively use their resources a little bit more efficiently when it comes to tariff policy. One thing I wanted to also say about these is, these are really quite interesting topics for them to choose. If you think about the whole world of Section 301, remember that Section 301 can be about trade agreement violations or unfair trade practices. So that's a really, really broad scope of mandate in that statute. And they chose these topics. I think of these topics as being extremely bipartisan topics. So forced labor is a topic that the Biden administration took up time and time again in its trade policy in the previous 4 years. And structural and excess capacity is frankly not that far off of some of the policies we saw under Biden as well when it came to supply chain resiliency. And I think at the time he was calling it friendshoring. And when you think about the 4-year process for Section 301s, these are going to be up for review in the next administration. So in the conception that there isn't a second Republican administration after Trump, and there's a blue wave, and we're in a Democratic administration in 2030, these are topics that are probably quite favorable to a Democratic administration. So they're a little bit more durable and bipartisan. So actually quite smart of this administration to choose these topics out of all unfair trade practices. It's also important to recognize that they chose these 301 investigations with complete certainty that they would be complete with the tariffs before the expiry of the Section 122 tariffs. And I know Courtney mentioned that yesterday. This is just the basic math. You can see in the statute exactly the timeline that's laid out, and you can see there on the left how they're able to pull that off with new tariffs being announced as the remedy to the 301 investigations days before the expiry of Section 122 tariffs. So there will be, with certainty, a seamless flow of tariffs. There won't be a gap. And we can pretty much count on that. So I just want to make sure folks are aware of that. So that gets us through most of the statutes he has at play. I left a few out in that analysis. 201 I left out because frankly, it's got a lot of restrictions on it that would not necessarily be favorable to the president. The limitation on timing, the limitation on the tariff rate, the requirement to phase it down, the proof of injury to domestic industry, all of these are things that are sort of extraneous to the ultimate goal. And so I just don't think that that would be as useful a statute to this president. And I think that they can generally achieve what they want to through 232 and 301. Not to say they won't be in use, but less likely to. Same with 338, simply because, again, I think you can achieve what they want to with the matrix they're creating of products and countries in 232 and 301. And 338 has that limit on the tariff rate and the discrimination against U.S. commerce that has to be proven. So again, less likely to be used, not out of the ballpark, but I think you can expect us to stay in this 232-301 phase for a good while. So what is he going to do with all of these tariffs? Because they're not just about imports. You have to remember that they're also squarely focused on exports and negotiations. So I think it was day one of the administration, they published the America First trade policy. And that really committed to growing exports and tackling the trade imbalance. And so I put up, my sector is dairy. I put up our exports data here on the screen just to point out how many sectors in the United States are really export reliant. When you think of a cow doesn't stop giving milk, and so if we can't find an outlet for that milk, we're in trouble. We produce more than we consume. We're super export dependent. And that's not unusual for agriculture as a broader sector. And so this administration knows that, and they're committed to tackling that trade deficit, that trade imbalance, not only through import decreases and tariffs with revenue generation, but also through export increases. And so that's important to keep in mind in the background, whether you sort of care about exports or not. This is a huge work stream for the administration. This is some kind of basic back of the napkin, if you will, tallying I've done personally. This isn't anything sort of, publicly stated by the administration, but just something that I've sort of kept track of. Back a year ago when they had the announcements of, I think it was called Liberation Day, and all the tariffs that came about through the reciprocal tariffs that were announced. At one point in time, we had counted up about 82 markets that had been considering entering into negotiations with the Trump administration. About 63 of those actually started that process or completed that process. And again, give or take, could be wrong. And then there's about 10 that have had agreements reached and announced without any framework. The administration is, without any details. The administration is calling these agreements frameworks. And then when they publish them with details, the 9 that you see there that are announced with details, they call them agreements. So it's frameworks versus agreements. I take that to mean one has details and you know what it is and the other doesn't. Altogether, that's about 19. And then there's one that none of those are actually in force except for one. And even that's not been entered into force formally. It's just kind of informally, we know that Cambodia has started reducing their tariffs on U.S. exports. So altogether, about 21 markets have reached agreement with the United States and are in the process of implementing those. I know there's been a lot of changes in tariffs lately, and that the administration's really focused on making sure these deals that were announced actually do reach completion and entry into force. We don't quite know when they will enter into force, and there's not really a public process about announcing when an agreement has entered into force. So that's one gap for us, or for anyone who's interested in exports, frankly, but something that we've discussed with them. And so what are these deals including? I would say this is a fascinating time in U.S. trade policy history for the fact that this is one of the first times that certainly in my lifetime I've seen us engage in this many trade negotiations that are unilateral in nature. So the administration is very open about the fact that we're not coming to the table with offensive and defensive concerns and what the United States will give and what the United States will receive. This is all about what other countries can do for us. And obviously they have the stick of the tariffs and getting some lowered tariffs if they agree to give us what we want. But there really is, aside from being scoped out of some of the 232 or 301 tariffs, there really is nothing else that we're bringing to the table. We're not committing to do anything else. It's been interesting to see how many of these markets are doing purchase commitments in addition to lowering tariffs. So this is just a chart I found and pulled of the kinds of provisions that are in these deals. If you haven't looked at them, I would say one column they're missing is tariff reductions. Almost every single deal has tariff reductions of some kind. And so that they're doing a lot to make sure that these agreements cover sort of a full range of commitments from other countries across a full range of sectors as well. So those will be going a long way to achieving hopefully what's needed for tackling that trade imbalance. But in addition to that, it's important to kind of point out that our largest trade agreement in the United States is currently under review. This is not necessarily related to the tariff policy that the president's undertaken, but it's a fascinating case study in and of itself, because if you recall, he's the one in his first term who said NAFTA was awful and needed to be scrapped and redone and turned into USMCA. And so now they negotiated into that in 2020 the idea of a review, and the fact that agreements, the business world isn't static and agreements shouldn't be either. And so we should review it. And turns out this review is taking place in his second administration. And instead of him coming along saying, this is my legacy and isn't it wonderful, he's actually really been threatening it. For the most part, because of Canada, relations with Canada have been pretty sour. And I think on both sides, neither side is engaging necessarily constructively on USMCA. And meanwhile, Mexico has. You can see here they kicked off their negotiations last month. They're actively meeting bilaterally with the United States. And Canada is just not part of that process. So there's some work to be done to figure out how to preserve this agreement and how much trade that contains within the timeline mandated by the review. I would just point out one thing that is of interest about USMCA is that if a party withdraws from it, the provisions say the concessions in the agreement exist for 10 years after the withdrawal. So we're in a tricky spot, because it's feasible that Trump could, throw his hands in the air, withdraw from the agreement. It's not working. I don't like it. And kind of walk away and have all those concessions remain in place and have their expiry be another person's problem, to be honest. So I think that the steps taken with Mexico reassure us a little bit that that won't happen. And certainly no one is interested in any kind of new agreement that has to be re-voted on by Congress. So we're in a little bit of a dance here for the next couple months until this gets sorted out. So where do we go from here with all of that? That's a lot. Let's talk about that. I thought about bucketing this into near term, midterm, and long term, just events to watch and what we know. We know this president has revenue generation goals and trade imbalance goals. I put up here an analysis that Section 122 could do more than just replace IEPA. I think the scoping of Section 301 and 232s could be the same. You're never going to see, I don't think, a period where this president is going to take the foot off the gas of those trade imbalance or revenue generation goals. So that's seamless stream of tariffs that we expect to see from 301, from 122 flowing into the 301 tariffs and the 232 tariffs throughout, are just going to continue throughout the summer and throughout the administration. But with that comes, inflationary pressures. We're definitely seeing that from some of the global conflict. The midterm elections will be huge. And frankly, we're coming up on, in Washington, sort of a turning period where, the run up to the midterm elections every summer is when you start to see some positioning and changing of policies in order to make those midterm elections go well. Certainly it's in the president's interest to try to make sure he's helping keep a majority in Congress if it's possible. I'm not particularly sure it's possible, frankly. We've seen a lot of resignations recently in the House. That puts us down. I was just doing the count a couple of days ago to, I think, within one or two person majority, depending on how those races go, those special elections go for the resignations. So we're a razor thin majority right now in Congress for this. If you're looking at it from a Trump administration trying to maintain that majority, and just with the inflation and all those other things going on, it'll be a real tough sell to keep that majority in place after the midterms. So that'll be a change and something to watch how he plays the midterm elections and the period leading up to it. And then, of course, the geopolitical tensions, which I'll touch on again later, but there is a lot at play, probably more than we think about on the day-to-day. As we look at China relations, President Trump is going to China very shortly, at the same time as China just met with Taiwan's opposition leader. Venezuela's practically not been in the news at all, but there's still activity going there in terms of bolstering U.S. investments there. And then you have Iran and the Strait of Hormuz and all of that to unpack. So all of these things could certainly weigh into how much they're able to stay on this path of tariffs and trade imbalance and revenue generation. And then as you think about the medium term, I just think about near term as sort of these next several months. Medium term, the remainder of the Trump administration, he's going to have to think about how to preserve some version of USMCA. Maybe it'll be the same text, but bilaterally negotiated, so it doesn't have to be voted on through Congress without changes. He's going to have to figure out that Mexico-Canada relationship in a way that gives some stability to our greatest trading partners here to our north and our south. I also think that he's going to be really focused on continuing to negotiate his agreements on reciprocal trade and implementing them, right? If you think back about the beginning, about trying to create some durable policies that last beyond his administration, these would be one of the most durable things if he can get them agreed to, implemented, and in practice long enough before the end of his administration. He'll continue to implement and maintain these tariff sections that we've been talking about as his primary tools, I think. I also think that he's going to continue to push business deals on reshoring sectors. So if you looked at the 232 investigation announcements, pharmaceuticals, on metals, but I think the pharmaceutical one was especially interesting. A large number of annexes that there in that announcement were tied to specific businesses engaging in a deal and a carve out for those businesses who were agreeing to manufacture pharmaceuticals domestically. So when there are significant sectors that are taking on an effort to reshore their manufacturing, they've clearly shown their willingness to sort of engage in a business negotiation and a deal and include those deals in executive orders. So I absolutely think that would continue. And I think there's possibilities for if he can kind of get through the midterms, if he can get through some of the current difficulties with how Iran is going and calm that region. I think he'll really want to enshrine what he's done in Venezuela, cement it so that it doesn't sort of dissolve upon his departure from office. And frankly, I could see where he'd want to see a knock-on effect with Cuba and use the change in Venezuela to force Cuba to change their policy and change U.S. policy towards Cuba. It's a little ambitious, but he's certainly been ambitious before, and these are things that he's openly talked about. And then China. I think that China is one where there is a mandate within the administration right now to create stability. Don't try to negotiate a deal. Don't try to, set the Chinese on fire. Just create some trade stability. And so they're going to need a way to go from talks that create stability to having that be permanent and something that trade can rely on. So how they do that is something he'll need to figure out in the remainder of the administration. And then you have beyond 2028. And so here's what we know. Being concerned about China or a little bit anti-China is something that has been bipartisan over the past, 8 years, 10 years. So this is not something that was Trump 1.0 went away and is coming back. It's really a point of bipartisan unity. I think it'll remain that way. And there's plenty of reasons for it. And in that same vein, the push to diversify U.S. reliance on China will also continue. So the push to get businesses to diversify away from China, to not need to import as much from China, to find other sources of, amino acids and critical minerals, et cetera. These are all things that are really bipartisan in nature and could easily endure as policy priorities beyond this president. I think you would see and again, I'm approaching 2028 and beyond from the perspective of you probably would see a blue wave and a Democratic administration, but I think these would be true either way. In the case of a Democratic administration in 2028 and beyond, I do think you'd see a reversal of some tariffs, but I really caution against someone saying, a Democrat would come in and clean house and all the tariffs would go away and everything would go back to normal, because that's not what we saw. We didn't see that happen with Biden. Like I said, Biden maintained a bunch of the Section 301 tariffs on China. And I think it's highly possible that they would come in a few years and say, actually, maintaining a 301 tariff for forced labor on country X is actually right, and they haven't dealt with forced labor, and we're going to do that. So I do think there will be a reversal of some. I don't think anyone should consider it a clean sweep on those tariffs. I also think a Democratic administration would probably revert to fewer trade negotiations. On the export side, I love it. We've seen more trade agreement negotiations in the past year than we've seen in probably 15, 20 years. I can't even remember. So to think about that continuing in a Democratic administration, I really doubt it. I don't think that they would be that focused on it. And then a greater focus on the multilateral fora. This president withdrew us from the World Health Organization, thought about withdrawing us from the World Trade Organization, and then didn't, et cetera, et cetera. I think a Democratic administration would re-engage in those areas. And then on the global stage. So, putting aside what happens domestically, one of the things that's been consistent, not just in the US, but what we see in Europe, in Canada, and other places, is a kind of growing on the rise of nationalism. And so I think that'll remain and continue to grow. And at the same time, we've seen partisan views that grow farther apart. Again, this is not a US phenomenon. We've seen it happen across the world. And so I think personally, those two factors are likely to continue. Also think you really have to pay attention to what's happening in the global conflict. If you talk to any sort of China file, there's specific predictions on when Xi Jinping might make a move on Taiwan, and we are sort of squarely in that zone. He's certainly been acting increasingly aggressively towards Taiwan, and increasingly hostile towards countries like the US that engage with Taiwan as if it's its own country. So I don't think that you can set aside the prospect of what China is doing with Taiwan and when Xi Jinping might act on that as part of his greater legacy. It's an openly stated policy goal of his to take on Taiwan. And so we really need to pay attention to that because that has significant ramifications on our supply chains. Same with Iran. I think it's been so busy in terms of policy and world events that probably a lot of us were surprised about Iran. But if you were watching, probably shouldn't have been. Iran has been actively enriching its uranium and growing its nuclear capabilities at dramatic rates, thanks in part to China's assistance and support. And so Iran and the conflict there is really a response to that, to Iran becoming so dangerously close to nuclear armament that the United States felt like we had to do something about it. But in the process of that is what Iran has done regionally, which is attack all its neighbors. And so that's created just a complete falling apart in the region, and a destabilizing element in the region that is going to be really hard to recover in the near term. And so even if you dealt with Iran in a vacuum, you'd still have that whole frayed, tense relationship across the region to deal with. And then there's Russia after Ukraine. I just don't see a world in which Putin is going to decide he's satisfied. And so maybe he takes what he's got with Ukraine and say, I'm done saturating and trying to deal with that. And there's always the prospect of Georgia or Moldova or Belarus or others. So I think those are some things to think about and watch on the longer term global stage. I know that was a lot of doom and gloom, but stick with me. So when we talk to our members about how to engage and how to advocate in all of that stuff that I just went through, because it's a lot, I think you have to understand this administration first and foremost. So we understood sort of the policy tools and the philosophies, and now you have to understand sort of how they're operating, because it's so unlike where we've come from. And so one of the things you have to understand is this administration came into office prepared. They had hundreds of executive orders written before inauguration. They kind of spent the entirety of the Biden administration not only believing that they should have been in office, but believing that they would be so again. And so they had 4 years to just rebuild all of this and research, prepare policy strategies, prepare executive orders. And so that's why if it felt like they hit the ground running, they did. I think another thing you have to understand is speed is a negotiating tactic. I mean, the timing of announcements happening on weekends, giving 24 hours for a response, or setting tariff announcements with an implementation 3 days later to allow that country to respond. Speed has been used throughout consistently as a negotiating tactic. So we have to understand that that's going to absolutely continue. There's not going to be sort of a foot coming off the gas pedal. I also think this president and its administration uses history as a lesson. You know, if you look at how Maduro and Venezuela happened, it was very reminiscent of Panama several decades ago. And so I don't, it's not always a plug and play, but it's certainly an administration that has evaluated history and learned from it and drawn, pick and chosen what they think will work as appropriate. And it's a business-oriented administration. So the bottom line is bottom dollar. They're going to continue to focus on revenue generation, continue to focus on money, and making sure they're resetting sort of that trade deficit. But you know, you also got to acknowledge the fact that for this president, at least, the bottom line is his legacy. He's renaming buildings. He's trying to make changes that are as permanent as they can be, so that we don't come into a Democratic administration in 2020 and find, you know, things totally go back to the way they were. He really wants a durable legacy to come out of this administration. And I think it's important to also understand that this is a president who's had an entire career and an entire lifetime built on litigation and winning lawsuits. So to him, you know, taking an action, a policy action, and then being challenged in the courts, even at the Supreme Court level, really doesn't faze him. I think it's something he's done all his life. And so, you know, that sort of tongue-in-cheek, so sue me, is a real thing with this administration. So when you understand kind of all that way he's operating, this is what we tell our members to do. We tell them to pay attention to the details. So this means don't just read the headline of an article and believe it. You have to go to the source. You have to understand what it's actually saying. And so great examples of this would be President Trump posts something on about tariffs being implemented on Canada on Truth Social, but nothing comes out of the White House as an executive order. And so the media goes crazy with it, and everybody thinks we're going to tariff Canada at 150%. You don't go there until the details are out and available, which leads to the second one, and that is nothing's final until it's final. I can't tell you how many times my trade friends and I in DC say this. You just got to wait for the final and wait for it to be implemented to understand that a text is final. Just with that speed negotiating tactic, and frankly, with him using media as a tool and another negotiating tactic, nothing's really final until it's final. So make sure that you're not looking at a draft or making judgments based on something that was just put out there on Truth Social. We also tell our members to ignore the bluster. So at IDFA, we have a lot of international members. We have a lot of Canadian members. And so one of the things that we talk about regularly is, you know, he's talking about Canada as a 51st state as just one example of some of the bluster that is put out there in this administration. We don't need to always jump in and engage and believe that. The fact of the matter is he stopped talking about Canada as a 51st state really quickly after Trudeau left office. It was like a known fact that he didn't like Trudeau, didn't get along with him well, and so stopped sort of poking the bear once Carney came along. Not completely, but much, much less. So there's a lot of bluster out there. You got to kind of ignore it, head down, see through it, and go back to the details. Same with the multi-pronged strategy. So be thinking about multiple options. I really appreciated Courtney yesterday going through and talking about mitigation strategies for companies to adopt on tariffs. I think those are important. Advocacy is important. So keep a strategy that uses all your tools across all of those levels. Knowing your options, doing your homework, that's really consistent with, that's what this administration does. They try to know their options, they do their homework, they have research. So, you know, when you're advocating and thinking about engaging with them, make sure you're bringing to the table what you can do, what what your details are, what your facts are. And almost perhaps most importantly is come ready to make a deal. This is actually something the administration has said to trading partners when they want to come in about negotiations and agreements and lowering their tariff. The discussion is always, well, what are you gonna propose? What deal are you gonna make? Don't just come in and ask, oh, I want my tariffs lowered. Come in with something to offer. And so we tell our members that too. We try to do the same, where we know this administration, for instance, wants to reduce the consumption of artificial colors. Well, we said, okay, we know they're going to go in that direction. What is it that we can do that we could live with, that we would like? And our members voluntarily got together in the ice cream sector and said, hey, well, we could do a voluntary commitment that we'll take synthetic colors out of our products ourselves before they make that policy, if you'll go and propose that to them. So we brought that in as a proposal and they loved it. They absolutely loved it. And that allows us to be in the driver's seat on what policies we're going to implement on ourselves or not. So come ready to make a deal. That's the language of this administration. You got to speak their language. So that's what we tell our members is about how to engage. I threw some resources here in at the end. You probably know all these things, and these are just a few places to find some of the information of what I've talked about today. More than anything, I would just say it kind of takes a village to understand trade in this this environment, and so consider me and your friends at FPSA resources. While I'm happy to answer any questions, so I put my contact information up there if you'd like to reach out to me after today.
Thanks, Becky. If anybody has questions, you can put them into chat. We'll try to get to those and hear. What a fantastic presentation. Very interesting view of what's going on. I had a question, if I can throw one in here, having not written it in chat, but as you mentioned, the first Trump administration put on a bunch of tariffs that the Biden administration did not take off. They kept those going, and now we're back again with the Trump administration. As you've demonstrated, the approach to tariffs and trade policy is less about the big multinational agreements. A lot of those were the U.S. trying to drive lowering of borders for trade, helping smaller countries grow. And now it's all one-on-one negotiations, and we're wielding trade policy for our own ends now. It's kind of a different mindset, right? Given that has existed now for 3 administrations, is there a movement to redo the trade policy tools? I mean, you've talked about 232 and 301 and their limitations and all that, but if you're actually thinking about going forward and using trade and tariffs in a different way, right, a more muscular way as we're doing, is there a movement to say, well, we need a different policy that allows us to do what we want to do? Is that happening?
Yeah, I took out a slide I was going to do on the role of Congress just for time's sake. But I think the short answer is not right now, because there's several in Congress and several initiatives in Congress where they'd like to sort of reassert the congressional authority and claw back some of these statutes so that they can't be used so freely. But while you have a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and a Republican president, that it's not going to go anywhere. And so effectively, even if you could get something passed through Congress, the president's never going to sign it into law, these changes, because he clearly loves the statutes he has. So I think anything like that could have the potential in a future administration. Even then, you have to kind of look at the reality of Congress today. The fact that they've been unable to keep the government fully funded. On the ag side, we haven't had a farm bill in many years. So there's just a lot of challenges Congress faces as a body in and of itself to be able to see real reform all the way through.
And if one of the houses in Congress changes in November, will that will they be able to put a break? Are they intending to put a break on some of the 301 stuff that's happening right now? You said that's really a bipartisan effort, right? So,
Yeah, I mean, listen, they could put legislation forward and do a vote on it, and maybe say they said, the president exceeded his authority on Section 301, and they put a bill out there that takes that back. The problem is it has to go all the way through to the Senate and then to be signed by the president in order to become law, and so that's just never going to happen. And until we get to a new administration at a minimum.
um, so as you've talked about your international partners, basically strap in because this is what's going to be like until 2028. I mean, this is going
Right.
to be happening, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, great. So, there's a comment about can we believe uh, anything that
A
Mr.
word,
Trump
a
says?
word Trump says. Well, listen, I mean, I think that goes to the point I made about ignoring the bluster,
Yeah.
right? Like, and I'll just go back to the Canada example. He talked about Canada as a 51st state. He talked about Canadians are really Americans, and that's the bluster part. But when you pair the rest of what he said with action, he's been pretty consistent. And he said Canada, their policies are unfair. They don't come to the table and engage constructively, and so we've had higher tariffs with Canada. We've had worse discussions with Canada. We haven't been engaging with Canada in negotiations. So when I was saying ignore the bluster, that's what I mean. I mean, another example would be Greenland, right? We're going to take it over and Denmark can just sell it. That's the bluster. What you have to get to is under the surface, the actions where he engaged with NATO in conversations to talk about where U.S. defense could be placed on Greenland and what could be given to the United States with respect to Greenland as a placement for U.S. national security. Not about buying the island or taking it over and invading it. So it's hard to do, but if you're surrounded by it in Washington all the time like me, I guess it becomes practice. But
Could
you
you
gotta kind of see past some of those big sensationalistic headlines.
And so could you touch on for our audience, the conversations you and I have had about the role of advocacy and also the carve-outs that have been accomplished when under IEPA? I mean, I think, if you're just looking at it from standing back, it seems like it's a blanket policy, everybody's getting hit. But in fact, there are important carve-outs and advocacy and the role that advocacy plays in having those occur. Could you touch on that?
Sure. Yeah, we've talked about the fact that, last September, the president published an executive order that had a long list of tariff exclusions. When you talk to USTR, those were based on their own research of, things that we don't have the climate to make here. Maybe we don't have the climate to grow it ourselves or make it ourselves. We don't have the resources, things like that. And then they fell short of doing anything that we don't make at all because they do want to reshore some things. And so that exists, and that still is valid today, that list. When we've talked to USTR and advocacy about, well, hey, what you really need is a process. You need a process where people can transparently come and say, I want this HS code to be exempt from tariffs, and here's my rationale, and to know how to engage in a process like that. The Ambassador Greer was really open and saying, well, we're not going to create a process until we get through what happened with the Supreme Court. Well, they've passed the Supreme Court timeline. They have not quite passed the timeline for appealing the Supreme Court. So I think they'd be more open to a process now than they were about 6 months ago. And you also see them in some of the metals and pharmaceutical 232 announcements, carving out some tariffs there, some HS codes from the tariffs there too, or at least taking a lower rate than the uppermost limit. So they're certainly open to the concept. They've been unwilling to engage in the process, I think, because of that speed factor and things have been moving so quickly. I think we're going to get to a place where things will settle down a little bit. I'd love to see a scenario where we both maintain some of the exclusions that were published in September, and there's a process where we can go in and say, hey, look, on the dairy side, cheese shredding equipment, for instance, is only made in other countries, and we'd love to make more here, but we just can't turn a ship around on a dime. And so, help us in the meantime. There should be no reason to have that in the longer term. So I would hope that this year yet, maybe we could get to the place of having a process. And that's something that you all alongside us and others could go in and advocate for.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's important to remember that there is relief available, but just as you said with your, how to engage, be prepared, know the details, come to make a deal, make your argument as to why. I know on our side, as we've talked, right, a lot of the specialty steel and stuff that our OEMs are using, right, how are those companies supposed to be expanding their production, being innovative if they've got tariffs on these types of items, right? It's a good argument to make, right? So it'll be interesting to see. Thank you for that. The process comes forward after time here. So that's great. Are there any other questions from anybody that's listening in? This has been just a great, like, big picture view after the kind of tactical stuff yesterday. So it's been very, very interesting to hear Becky's view.
Well, hopefully there's not a lack of questions because everyone's feeling really pessimistic now about the future. I'm a glass half full kind of person, so I'm sorry if everyone's walking away in need of some therapy, but I appreciate the opportunity to kind of share some thoughts with you all today.
Yeah,
And
well,
please feel free to reach out to me anytime.
yeah, I think this is a conversation that we all, our associations and our peer associations, we need to keep having, right? I mean, this is part of the mission of the association. So I want to thank you very much. I mean, it's been really, really good spending this time with you and hearing what you have to say. And if you've joined us over the past 2 days for both of these webinars, thank you very much. I think it's been really successful and very interesting. And as we said, our commitment to our members is to keep bringing forward these topical questions and keep you informed, give you practical information of what to do, and looking forward as to what's happening. And so please, from the FPSA viewpoint, take a look at our events calendar for other webinars that we have ongoing. Take a look at IDFA's. Check out your webinars too over there, see what's going on. We've got conversations with women in food production coming up, one of our conversation roundtables webinars that we put on periodically. So take a look at our calendar for that. So thanks again for being with us. It's been really appreciating your time and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much, Becky. We're talking
Thank
soon.
you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.